Look at this. Banged up before we even start. Is this the best they could send us? Someone who can't even stay out of a bar fight. The words, sharp and dripping with condescension, cut through the low hum of the advanced training facility's briefing room. The nervous laughter that followed was a cruel echo, a chorus of complicity from the 24 other candidates. They were all large men, sculpted by years in the gym and on the field, their uniforms straining against broad shoulders and thick necks. They looked like the recruitment posters promised. And then there was Petty Officer Specialist Sarah Jenkins. She did not react. Her gaze remained fixed on the intricate components of the Mark IV deep submergence rebreather laid out on the sterile white table before her. Her hands, slender and scarred, moved with an unhurried, methodical grace, checking seals, calibrating sensors, and coiling lines with a practiced economy that was almost hypnotic. The bruises on her face, a galaxy of purple and yellow blooming across her left cheekbone and trailing down her jaw, were stark against her pale skin, but she seemed completely unaware of them, as if they were nothing more than a temporary change in weather. But when Admiral Thorne, observing from the darkened, soundproof gallery above the briefing room, saw her stance, the way her weight was perfectly centered, the subtle but constant readiness in her posture, a coiled stillness that spoke of immense potential energy, he felt a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory from a world of shadows and whispers. If you believe that true strength is measured in action, not volume, type competence below. The source of the condescension, Lieutenant Commander Davis, paced before the assembled candidates like a preening rooster in his own barnyard. He was the supervisor of this final selection phase, the gatekeeper to one of the Navy's most elite and secretive programs, deep submergence operations. It was his job to weed out the weak, the undisciplined, the unworthy. And in Petty Officer Jenkins, he saw a perfect example of everything he despised. He saw a liability. He stopped directly in front of her table, forcing the entire room's attention onto her. Petty Officer, he began, drawing the title out with mocking slowness. This is not some back-alley brawl. This is the pinnacle of naval operations. We are selecting for professionals, individuals who represent the highest standards of discipline, both on and off duty. Your appearance suggests you fall significantly short of that standard. He gestured to her face with a dismissive flick of his hand. What are we to make of this? Did you have a disagreement with a bulkhead? Or does your conduct outside this facility reflect a similar lack of control? His rhetorical questions hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The other candidates shuffled their feet, some smirking, others staring at the floor, all of them creating a vast, isolating distance between themselves and Jenkins. Her world shrank to the small circle of light on her workbench. She finished a final diagnostic on the rebreather's primary oxygen sensor, the small green light blinking with a satisfying regularity. Only then did she look up, her eyes, a calm, clear gray, meeting Davis's for a brief, unreadable moment. "Understood, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, level, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was not the response of someone shamed or intimidated. It was the response of a machine acknowledging an input. This placid acceptance seemed to enrage Davis even more than defiance would have. He saw it as insolence, a silent refusal to grant him the satisfaction of a reaction. His face reddened. "We'll see how well you understand when you're 2,000 feet down in the black with a cascading system failure and a collapsing hull simulation. Discipline is what keeps you alive then, not whatever. This is," he sneered, his gaze sweeping over her small frame, his judgment absolute and final. Jenkins simply gave a short, single nod and returned her attention to her gear, her focus so complete that Davis, for all his volume and authority, ceased to exist. In the gallery above, Admiral Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He had seen that look before, that profound calm in the center of a storm. It was the look of the truly dangerous, the quiet professionals who had been to the edge and back so many times that the mundane provocations of men like Davis were as meaningless as the buzzing of a fly. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Lieutenant Commander Davis was making a terrible, terrible mistake. The briefing room was a microcosm of assumptions, a theater of prejudice where appearance was mistaken for reality. The air itself felt thick with testosterone and misplaced confidence, the nervous energy of men eager to prove their physical prowess. They saw Jenkins as an anomaly, a clerical error in the selection process. They saw a small woman with bruises on her face and assumed weakness, victimhood, or unprofessionalism. They could not see the years of relentless training etched into the fine muscles of her back, or the encyclopedic knowledge of schematics and emergency protocols stored behind her placid gray eyes. They did not understand that the world she operated in was one where brute strength was secondary to mental fortitude, where the ability to control one's own heart rate under unimaginable pressure was infinitely more valuable than the size of one's biceps. Her silence was not submission, it was a fortress. Inside its walls, she was calculating, observing, and preparing. Every insult, every dismissive glance was logged and discarded as irrelevant data. Her mission objective was to pass the simulation. The opinions of the men around her were just noise, a distracting frequency to be filtered out. The real test was not Davis's verbal assault, but the unforgiving physics of the deep ocean, a place that cared nothing for ego or appearance. That was the enemy she respected, the one she was preparing to face. The simulation began. The heavy steel hatch of the immersion tank sealed with a resounding clang and the hiss of pressurized air, plunging the four-person team into an artificial world of cold, darkness, and crushing silence. They were inside a mock-up of the Navy's newest deep-sea exploration submersible, the Odyssey, supposedly resting on a simulated seabed 2,000 feet below the surface. Outside the thick viewport, there was only an impenetrable, inky black. Lieutenant Commander Davis sat enthroned in the control room, a brightly lit sanctuary of monitors and blinking lights, observing their biosignatures and internal camera feeds like a petty god. "All right, team." His voice crackled through their comms, artificially calm. "Begin standard diagnostic and report status." The three male candidates began their work with a practiced but tense efficiency, their voices a half-beat too quick as they ran through their checklists. Jenkins remained silent, her movements fluid and deliberate as she interfaced with her assigned console, her hands gliding over the controls. In the control room, Davis smirked at a junior technician. "Watch this," he murmured. "Let's see how our brawler handles a little pressure." He tapped a sequence of commands into his master console. Inside the tank, the lights flickered violently and died. Red emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the cramped interior in a hellish, pulsating glow. A synthesized voice, jarringly calm, announced, "Warning, cascading system failure. Hull integrity at 70%. Reactor coolant leak detected." A deep, shuddering groan, broadcast through powerful transducers, vibrated through the simulator's hull. It felt terrifyingly real. On the control room monitors, the biofeeds for the three male operators spiked dramatically. Heart rates shot past 160. Respiration became ragged. "What's happening?" "I've lost primary power," one shouted. "Comms are down. I can't get a response from engineering," another yelled, his voice tight with panic. Davis leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. This was the first filter, the moment of pure, unadulterated chaos designed to break the unprepared. He watched Jenkins's monitor with keen anticipation, waiting for her vitals to follow suit, waiting for the crack in her calm facade. But they didn't move. Her heart rate remained a steady 72 beats per minute. Her respiration was slow, deep, and even. On her helmet cam, they could see she hadn't even flinched. She was methodically working her console, her fingers dancing across the touch-sensitive surface, bypassing fried circuits and rerouting auxiliary power with a speed and precision that was simply inhuman. She wasn't panicking. She was hunting. The chaos escalated. A simulated secondary explosion rocked the submersible, the sound a deafening boom that made the technicians in the control room jump. The helmet cams of the three male candidates went wild, showing spinning, disoriented views of the cabin before two of them went dark completely. "Man down. I think Miller's unconscious," the remaining male operator gasped, his voice bordering on a scream. I can't see." His biosignature flatlined on the screen, indicating a simulated fatality. The mission was, for all intents and purposes, a catastrophic failure. The team had been wiped out in under 3 minutes. Davis sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Well, that's that," he announced to the control room. "An abysmal performance. Shut down. Begin recovery protocol." He was already mentally composing the scathing after-action report that would permanently disqualify all 4 candidates. But a junior technician, his eyes wide, pointed a trembling finger at the main screen. "Sir, look," Davis turned, annoyed. "Look at what ensign? The mission is over," but it wasn't. Amidst the 3 red, flatlined biosignatures, one remained a steady, pulsing green. Jenkins. Her helmet cam was stable, a clear view of a complex engineering panel that was supposed to be inaccessible after a primary power failure. She had pried it open manually. On the audio feed, there was no sound of panic, only the soft, rhythmic puff of her rebreather. She was alone, in the dark, in a dying machine, and she was working. "What is she doing?" Davis whispered, his arrogance momentarily forgotten, replaced by a thread of genuine confusion. "She's trying to manually override the reactor coolant system." The technician breathed, his voice full of awe. "But that's not possible. The access codes are locked out during a cascading failure. It's a hardwired safety protocol." On the screen, Jenkins's gloved hands moved with the impossible delicacy of a surgeon. She wasn't entering codes. She was physically rewiring the bypass, using a small multi-tool she had extracted from a hidden compartment in her suit. She was treating the ship's nervous system like a puzzle, one she had clearly solved before. The control room fell into a deep, profound silence. Every technician, every officer was glued to the screen, watching this one steady green light in a sea of red. They were witnessing something that defied the parameters of the simulation itself. Davis stood motionless, his mouth slightly agape. The impossible was happening right before his eyes. The smug certainty he had worn like a suit of armor was cracking, piece by piece, revealing the bewildered man beneath. He had designed this test to be unbeatable, a crucible to separate the best from the rest. He had never, in 1,000 runs, seen anyone even attempt what she was doing, let alone with such unnerving, silent competence. The final sequence required 27 distinct commands, entered in a precise order, with timings accurate to the millisecond, to prevent a simulated core meltdown. A single error would trigger an instant mission failure. They watched as her hands flew, a blur of motion. Green lights blinked on the schematic in a perfect, ascending sequence. Finally, she pressed one last panel. The red strobes died. The shuddering groans ceased. A moment of absolute blackness and silence. Then, the normal, soft white cabin lights flickered back on. A new voice, calm and clear, filled the submersible and the control room. Reactors shut down. Successful. Auxiliary power restored. Hull integrity stabilized. The message flashed in large green letters on the main screen. The aftermath was a silence more profound than any noise. It was a vacuum, filled with the collective, unvoiced shock of 24 men. Into that vacuum of stunned disbelief, a new presence descended. The door to the upper observation gallery slid open with a soft hiss, and Admiral Thorne walked down the short flight of stairs into the control room. He moved with the quiet authority of a man long accustomed to command, his weathered face impassive, his eyes sweeping over the frozen tableau before him. The technicians and junior officers snapped to attention, their shock momentarily overridden by ingrained discipline. Lieutenant Commander Davis, however, remained rooted to the spot, his gaze still locked on the successful message on the screen, as if he could will it away by staring. He looked like a man who had just seen a law of physics casually defied. Thorne ignored him completely. He walked past the command chair, his footsteps the only sound in the room, and stopped before the junior technician who had first noticed Jenkins's continued progress. "Son," the Admiral's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Pull up the complete, unredacted personnel file for Petty Officer Specialist Sarah Jenkins." "Security override." Thorne, Gamma 27, the technician fumbled with his keyboard, his fingers suddenly clumsy. A moment later, Jenkins's file bloomed across the main screen. It was not the standard, one-page summary Davis had briefly glanced at. This was pages long, dense with blacked outlines, cryptic operational code names, and commendations that made the room gasp. Admiral Thorne turned to face the assembled staff, his expression hard as granite. He let them read the screen, let the impossible truth sink in. He began to speak, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, each word landing like a precision strike. "Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Echo Squadron," he read, his eyes fixed on Davis. "For those of you who don't know, that unit doesn't officially exist. It's a ghost element tasked with problems no one else can solve." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. "Primary military occupational specialty, deep submergent salvage and explosive ordnance disposal. Secondary, covert technical operations and systems exploitation." He gestured to the simulator schematic on the adjacent screen. "She didn't just pass your test, Commander. She co-wrote the source code for the failure protocols you just used. She designed this impossible scenario 2 years ago." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Davis's face had gone from shock to ashen. The Admiral wasn't finished. He pointed to a long list of classified mission names. Operation Night Serpent, Operation Abyssal Trident, the Karsk Sea Incident. These are just words to you. To Petty Officer Jenkins, they were deployments where she was the only one qualified to do the job, operating alone for weeks at a time in environments that would crush a normal human being in seconds. He then looked directly at Davis, his gaze drilling into him. "You asked about her face, Commander." The Admiral's voice dropped even lower, becoming a lethal whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "Those bruises, Lieutenant Commander, were earned 3 days ago during her final recertification for the new Ares-class combat dive suit. The test involves full-contact sparring against 3 Tier 1 operators. The goal is not to win. The goal is to survive for 6 hours and remain combat effective." Petty Officer Jenkins put 2 of her opponents in the infirmary with fractured ribs and a dislocated shoulder. She passed. Her bruises are not a sign of indiscipline. They are a testament to a level of dedication and toughness you cannot possibly comprehend. He let the final, brutal sentence hang in the air. The sound of the immersion tank's hatch being unsealed echoed through the silent room. All heads turned as Jenkins climbed out, dripping water onto the deck plating. Her hair was slicked back, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were as calm and steady as ever. She saw the room full of staring faces, the Admiral, her file on the main screen, and her expression didn't change. She simply stood, waiting for her next instruction. Admiral Thorne turned his back on the control room staff and faced her. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Admiral Thorne, a living legend, a man who had commanded fleets and advised presidents, a man who hadn't saluted a junior enlisted sailor in a quarter of a century, snapped to the most rigid and respectful position of attention. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the air. "Petty Officer Jenkins," he said, his voice resonating with a profound respect that stunned everyone present into breathlessness. "On behalf of the United States Navy, thank you. Your performance was, as always, beyond exemplary." "Welcome back." Jenkins looked at the Admiral, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not surprise, but acknowledgement, passed through her eyes. She returned the salute, her own movements just as precise. "Thank you, Admiral," she said simply. Then Thorne's attention returned to the room, and specifically to the man who was now visibly trembling. "Lieutenant Commander Davis," the Admiral said, his voice returning to the cold, flat tone of command. You are a manager of equipment. You sit in a comfortable chair and you watch screens. Today, you judged a warrior by the scars she earned in service to this nation. You mistook evidence of her profound commitment for a lack of discipline. Your assumptions are a disgrace to your rank and an embarrassment to this command. You will learn the difference between what something looks like and what it is. Pack your desk. You are reassigned, effective immediately. Dismissed, Davis stood for a moment, his world completely dismantled, then turned and walked out of the control room without a word, the sound of his footsteps a hollow retreat. The legend had begun. The story of the Admiral's salute spread through the naval base like a shockwave. It traveled faster than official reports, carried on whispers in the mess halls, retold in the smoky air of the enlisted clubs, and debated in the hushed tones of the officers' quarters. Every retelling added a new layer of myth. In one version, Jenkins had single-handedly fought off a simulated Kraken. In another, she had rewritten the submersible's operating system from memory while upside down and underwater. The core facts, however, remained unchanged and undeniable. The quiet woman with the bruised face, the arrogant commander, the impossible simulation, and the Admiral's unprecedented gesture of respect. She became a symbol, a living embodiment of the command's most deeply held, if often forgotten, ideal. Competence is the only currency that matters. The name Jenkins took on a new meaning. It became shorthand for silent, overwhelming proficiency. Instructors started using her as an example. Don't talk about it, be about it. Be a Jenkins. Young sailors, men and women alike, who felt overlooked or underestimated, saw in her a hero. She hadn't shouted or argued or demanded respect. She had earned it in the crucible of performance, forcing the institution itself to bend to the undeniable truth of her skill. The other candidates from that fateful simulation were the most potent evangelists of her legend. They had been there. They had seen it. They had felt the simulated chaos that broke them, and they had watched her move through it with the calm of a morning tide. Their initial snickers and complicit silence had curdled into a profound and lasting shame, which they worked to expiate by ensuring no one ever made the same mistake they had. We laughed at her. One of the hulking operators confessed to a group of new recruits, his voice low and serious. We judge her by her size, by the marks on her face. We were fools. We were standing next to a giant and didn't even know it. Her presence had a subtle but powerful effect on the culture of the entire facility. The casual arrogance, the focus on superficial appearances began to recede, replaced by a more watchful, more thoughtful atmosphere. People started looking at each other differently, wondering what hidden depths, what classified histories might lie behind a quiet demeanor. The consequences for Lieutenant Commander Davis were swift and severe. He was reassigned to a logistics depot in the most remote, forgotten corner of the naval map. It was a career-ending post, a bureaucratic exile. The official reason was failure to properly assess personnel capabilities, but everyone knew the real reason. He had committed the ultimate sin in the world of elite operations. He had allowed his prejudice to blind him to reality. The story followed him, of course. It was a ghost that haunted his new, smaller office. He would overhear whispers from the civilian dock workers, see the knowing glances from junior officers who had heard the tale. For weeks, he was consumed by bitterness and a sense of injustice. He replayed the event in his mind, trying to find a way he was right, a way she had cheated, a way the Admiral was mistaken. But he couldn't. The data was irrefutable. Her performance was perfect. His judgment was flawed. The slow, painful erosion of his ego began. One evening, sitting alone in his drab office, he pulled up the official report on the Car C incident, one of the missions listed in Jenkins's unredacted file. He had to use the Admiral's security override, which was still, for some reason, active on his profile. What he read chilled him to the bone. A Russian submarine had sunk in Arctic waters, its experimental nuclear reactor threatening to melt down and create an environmental catastrophe of unimaginable scale. The Russians had secretly asked for American help. They sent one person, Jenkins, She had performed a solo dive in near-freezing water to a depth that was classified, bypassed the damaged Russian security systems, and manually secured the reactor, saving the entire European coastline from radioactive contamination. She was 22 years old at the time. Davis closed the file and stared at his hands for a long time. He thought of his own accomplishments, commendations for efficiency, reports filed on time, budgets balanced. They were meaningless. He had been a manager, a bureaucrat. He had never once faced the kind of pressure she lived with as a matter of course. The next day, he sat down and wrote a formal letter of apology to Petty Officer Jenkins, care of Admiral Thorne. He didn't make excuses or ask for forgiveness. He simply stated that he had been wrong, that his conduct had been unprofessional, and that her skill and dedication were an honor to the Navy. He knew she might never see it, but he had to write it. It was the first step in rebuilding not his career, but his character. Meanwhile, Jenkins remained utterly unaffected by her newfound fame. She deflected any praise with a quiet, "I was just doing my job." She was seen in the training tank, long after hours, mentoring the very candidates who had once mocked her. She never mentioned the simulation or the Admiral. She simply taught. She showed them how to control their breathing to conserve air, how to read a complex schematic in low light, how to remain calm when every instinct screamed panic. Her lessons were delivered not through lectures, but through demonstration. Her philosophy was clear. Excellence was a habit, not an event. The technicians in the control room, out of a shared sense of reverence, took it upon themselves to create a small, unofficial monument. They took the raw data log from her historic simulation run, a beautiful, perfect cascade of code and biometrics, and framed it. Below it, they affixed a small, polished brass plaque. It didn't mention her name. It simply said, "The Standard." It hung on the wall of the control room, a silent, constant reminder that assumptions are the enemy of truth and that true professionalism needs no introduction. A year passed. The culture at the Naval Special Warfare Development Center had fundamentally shifted. The Jenkins Maneuver, as her impossible simulation run was now officially called, had become the capstone of the selection process. It was no longer considered unbeatable, but it remained the gold standard, a brutal but fair measure of a candidate's true mettle. Very few passed it, but the attempt itself forged better operators. The arrogant, chest-thumping attitude that had once been prevalent was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful professionalism. The instructors now taught a new, unofficial first lesson. You know nothing about the person standing next to you. Assume they are better than you, and strive to prove them right. Lieutenant Commander Davis, to everyone's surprise, was eventually brought back from his exile. Admiral Thorne, a man who believed in second chances if the lesson was truly learned, had received his letter of apology. Davis was a changed man. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and his eyes had lost their arrogant gleam, replaced by a deep-seated humility. He was made an instructor at the academy, and his first lecture to every new class began with the story of a young petty officer with a bruised face and the terrible mistake he had made in judging her. He told the story not to shame himself, but to arm his students against the most dangerous enemy they would ever face, their own prejudice. He became one of the facility's most respected teachers. Of Jenkins, there were only rumors. Her name was redacted from the facility's public records. She had moved on, absorbed back into the shadowy world of Echo Squadron. Some said she was working on a new generation of submersible technology. Others whispered she was deployed somewhere deep and dark, solving a problem the world would never even know existed. Her legacy, however, was not in the rumors. It was in the quiet confidence of the new generation of operators, in the respectful silence of the briefing rooms, and in the small brass plaque that still hung on the control room wall. It was a legacy of action over words, of substance over style. It was the enduring lesson that the most formidable people are often the ones you notice least, their capabilities held in reserve, their worth proven not by the volume of their voice, but by the undeniable perfection of their work. True strength is not a broadcast. It is a quiet, internal hum of readiness. It is not found in the boastful declaration of one's own value, but in the silent, consistent, and irrefutable demonstration of it. Legacy is not a monument carved from stone and placed in a public square for all to see. It is a standard, a benchmark, a way of being that is passed down, not through stories but through action. It is the quiet professional who teaches us that respect is a mirror. It is not something you can demand from others, but something you command by first respecting your craft, your mission, and the quiet dignity of your own competence. The world is full of noise, of loud voices clamoring for attention, for validation, for recognition. But the work that matters, the work that changes things, the work that saves lives is often done in the silence, far from the spotlight. It is done by the steady hands, the calm heart, the focused mind. It is done by those who have nothing to prove, because their skill is its own proof. It is done by those who understand that the greatest power lies not in being seen, but in being effective. That is the enduring truth. That is the code of the quiet professional. That is the legacy of Sarah Jenkins. Her story became more than just a cautionary tale about arrogance. It became a foundational myth for a new era at the facility. It taught a lesson that resonated far beyond the world of deep-sea operations. It spoke to the universal human experience of being underestimated, of being judged by a superficial cover, while a wealth of hidden chapters lay within. It championed the idea that the world, in the end, bends to demonstrated excellence. The universe has a way of correcting imbalances, of allowing truth to surface, and of ensuring that true worth, no matter how quietly held, will eventually find its own light. The ripples of her actions continued to spread. The 2 Tier 1 operators she had hospitalized during her sparring session became her fiercest advocates within the highest echelons of Special Operations Command, telling anyone who would listen that she was the most formidable combatant, pound for pound, they had ever faced. This led to a complete overhaul of certain training doctrines, incorporating her methods of leverage and psychological composure over brute force. She was changing the very definition of a warrior, not by speaking on a podium, but by being an undeniable fact. The final, quiet victory was perhaps the most telling. Years later, when a new, state-of-the-art deep-sea training complex was commissioned, Admiral Thorne, in his last official act before retirement, was given the honor of naming it. He didn't name it after a famous general or a historic battle. He stepped up to the microphone, looked out over the crowd of dignitaries and naval officers, and said simply, "We name this facility the Jenkins Center for Operational Excellence." May we all strive to live up to her standard. It was the ultimate validation, a permanent etching of her quiet legacy into the very structure of the institution she served. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over ignorant prejudice and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.